Anyways, I was wondering on the archiving project if you only looked at newspapers or if you also looked at video journalism sources.
We started to gather data on video, and we have that. But for this particular project, we focused on newspapers, partially because we were concerned at looking at the already existing interventions into newspapers. Video is so much more chaotic that it's a whole different story. Do you want? But you looked a little at.
Yeah, I talked to CBC, our national broadcaster, just about their archiving practices, and it was very intricate, it's very complex, but I think we were still seeing the same issues in terms of what was being brought forward. They had different systems for their video, radio, and print, their online print, but we were still seeing the same issues of things not getting moved forward and things staying behind. So, yeah.
I had a question for Alex. It's Lisa Olson with the Houston Chronicle. Actually, I have two questions for you. One is, I was interested in you talking a little bit about the exit polling being so inaccurate, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how they improved that, because it seemed to me that the understanding of the evolution of Hispanic voters in the United States is phenomenally off base in Texas as well, and I wondered how it's been tweaked. And the other question is, I wondered if in your research, if you've thought of looking at broadcast, since often a lot of Latinos get more news, and so do non-Latinos from broadcast media. And it's been interesting to be in forums where folks from Univision talk about, for example, the way they cover news and the emphasis they put on voter education, for example, and community service news, and how that might influence their election coverage.
Yeah, I as a journalist, particularly in the 90s, I covered a lot of Univision issues, and they aren't very public with what they do and how they do it. They're very advocate, and they certainly are very successful, but they do issue a lot of control over their own internal information. It's hard to get information from them. In the case of 2000 in Florida, first of all, Florida as a Latino state is it's very complicated, to say the least. It doesn't represent the Latino community nationwide, because more than 60% of Latinos are Mexican or Mexican Americans in this country. 5% are Cuban, but that's 1/3 of Florida is Cuban. 10% is Puerto Rican, not including the island of Puerto Rico, and that's 1/3 of Florida. So it's very different, and it's changing very much. What we did back in '90, we talked to several posters. Sergio Dixon in particular was our main source, and even he was saying how he was taken by surprise. And he's an expert. He's been polling for decades, and he was the one that said we need to do a better job. And it was soon after that also. I know Ivan Roman, who is now the president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, NAHJ. He was at Orlando. He was one of the correspondents in Puerto Rico.
Just a comment on that, bringing it to Texas a little bit. When I was covering the elections here and the voter registration drives the efforts to increase participation among Hispanics, one of the things people were most talking about was the difference between the generations of Hispanic voters.
Right, and that's not because I have not been a journalist now for, 4 years. I haven't been following it as much, but I used to follow Texas politics, and I'm sure in the last 4 years I've missed stuff now.
I have a question for Juliette with your linking study. So what other kitchen sinks are you going to be investigating in terms of looking at your other linking? Where are you going to take your study next based on what you found so far at this point?
Oh, wow. That's a big question, and it's basically over because this was my dissertation, and this. But there are many other things that I could not talk about today that were also appearing, and I brought up that CMS stuff because it's the only finding of my research, because the other findings are not that fun, and I explored, for example, what factors in the could we find different linking practices according to different factors in the news set? For example, are there more links in the sports sections or in the politics sections or things like that? But it turns out that no, there are no big differences, and not that many links everywhere, and that's a boring finding in a way. But yes, this is basically where this research went after that.
And for Lisa and Paul, a question for the two of you. You brought this up as one of your points of opportunity but challenge. How do you see, in moving forward in the future, the relationship between archivists and journalists moving forward when we think about digital news content?
Well, I mean, I think that the CRL, the Center for Research Libraries, if any of you are familiar with it, is trying to really become a player here. Bernie Riley, for the past 2 years to 3 years, has really been, he's done a lot of case studies of archiving. He's met with folks at the New York Times. He's talked to folks at the Library of Congress and a lot of university librarians. I think he's been behind, sort of instigating a lot of these pilot projects. So if there are connections being forged, it's entirely really through his force of will. Without that force of will, there's really been no conversations going on. So you have university archivists working on in the States and a little in Canada, working on small pilot projects, but those projects aren't connected. But one of the things that comes up in the paper that we didn't bring forward so much is the connection between this idea of news as a common good versus news as a commercial good, and how that impacts archiving. So you see in Scandinavia and in France much more of an interest at the state level and state archivists in kind of investing in preserving news. And it really is connected to the way that news is seen within that media system.
I think we had a question over here.
Yes. Hi, I'm Sarah Peralta with Texas State, a graduate of Texas State University. I had a question about native advertising. So I think we can all agree that, native advertising, yes, they say all these things about it, but your study confirms what many advertisers already know, which is it is supposed to be sneaky. And I'm wondering if you think, or maybe can have some comments on, advertisers, I think, know that it kind of flies under consumers' radar, and that they don't recognize that they are reading ads. And I think that's part of the appeal for advertisers. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I know I've personally paid for my organization, native ads on social media platforms, and that's part of the appeal. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I do. Thank you for asking it like that. One of the things I was checking the Twitter feed, and I saw that many people had tweeted out our finding that there was no significant difference in credibility judgments between people who saw the traditional ads and people who saw the native ads. And the one thing I guess I would, if we could make this all into a tweet, the key part is also that it was less noticed. People did not identify the sponsored content, the native ads, as ads. So that's the big question mark in our study, I think, is if you were to tell them, hey, that was an ad you just saw, would that affect credibility? Or did it just fly completely under the radar, unidentified? And so I think that's like the big area of, the big question to answer right now. I know I have my own view, which is I suspect that at least for a certain demographic, I suspect people would then feel a little cheated.
Any other questions coming yet? Okay. I have a question for Claudia in regards to locative media. When we think about the idea of operationalizing curiosity in today's time frame and looking at locative media, how do you think that will play out as we've been hearing all day today in terms of looking forward at digital platforms beyond the current smartphone that we have, but even thinking about if you've even started thinking in this direction, the possibilities of how locative media can play out with live paper, for instance, or even the wearable technologies that we saw this morning. If you could talk a little bit about that, if that's something that you think would have a place within those digital platforms as well, aside from the smartphone currently.
Okay. So I really believe that this concept of curiosity is connected to location and history, because the big thing here about location is the fact that once you get the information when you are in the place, how this information is going to be useful for what you are doing there, right? So the sense of curiosity is almost like touchable in a way that the user is, for example, a young smartphone user is in a bar, and then this person discovered that bar used to be a silent movie, right? So this is the idea of curiosity is like a kind of, as I said very briefly during the conversation, is the fact that you provide the user the location with the history here is the curious element of the narrative. So you provide the user with a topic even for conversation, because another idea of the concept of curiosity and locative media here is that you provide a small piece of information on the application, and you can lead the user to your website. So, but at the moment when the person gets the information, they have something, the person has something to talk with a friend, for example. So, as I said, like the idea of changing your sense of place and being reconnected to the physical place. So the idea here of locative media is bringing us back to the physical world, right? So it's like kind of hybrid reality. So I would say that curiosity wouldn't work if you don't tie the information to the location where the user is. I don't know if it answers your question. But yeah.
Any other questions from the crowd? I don't want to keep you all from the happy hour, but let's give a round of applause to our researchers this afternoon.